All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to the Gumtree of Liberty podcast. I'm your host Stuart, and I'm joined today by my co-host CentristOzzy and guests James and Vitklim, members of the Lib Dems Party of South Australia. James is the chair of the policy committee of the South Australian branch of the Lib Dems. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Good to be back. Moving up in the world.
Now, with the election starting for your state on February 19th, as far as we know, I thought it'd probably be a good time to, work out how politics stands right now in your state. For those of us who aren't familiar with politics in South Australia, to work out how everything stands going into the election in your state and what the important issues are, and whether COVID is still the most important issue in your state as it is, and I think a lot of other places have it as an important issue. But I know you guys have also escaped a lot of the wrath of COVID that we've seen on the East Coast, being a bit more isolated. But before we get into that, I think it's probably important to lay down some ground rules for how the elections work for both the upper house and the lower house.
Sure. First, I think you said the 19th of February. It's the 19th of March is the election here in South Australia.
Yes.
So in terms of, and on that point, actually, an interesting fact about how the South Australian elections work is that our elections can be delayed by up to 21 days. So if the federal election is called in the same month or at a state of emergency, which we are technically in, I don't think the federal election will be called in March, but if it is, we might see it delayed. And I don't think they'll use the state of emergency to delay the election, but that is possible. But into the general structure of how it works, we do use so we have a 47-seat lower house, which we call the House of Assembly, and that is elected every 4 years. And then we have a 22-seat Legislative Council, which is our upper house or Senate, and that's elected. They have 8-year terms, so that half of that, 11 seats, will be elected this election, and the next 11 will be elected in 4 years' time. In terms of voting style, it is full preferential voting for the lower house, which is much like the House of Representatives in Australia, except we do actually have a group ticket mechanism. So if you only put one in, let's say you put one in the Liberal Party, and the Liberal Party posts their preference flow to the South Australian Electoral Commission, then that will actually be a valid vote, which, as far as I'm aware, is unlike the House of Representatives style voting. In terms of Legislative Council, it's actually very, very similar to the Senate voting. It's optional preferential, where you can put, if you just put one above the line, that will be a valid vote. It won't be a group ticket. It won't flow any further than the one that you've put it to, but it will actually be a valid vote, which is the same as the Senate through the savings provisions in the Senate. A lot of people don't know that, but that's still a valid vote in the Senate at the federal level. But in South Australia, that's actually, it says on the thing you only need to put a one, but you can put up to however many you want, or you can vote below the line, and all you need to do is put at least 6.
So that 8-year term, that's longer than the federal one. So
yeah,
how many seats do you have for election in the upper house then?
So yeah, 11 seats per election in the upper house will be up for election.
Yeah. So your houses are the Legislative Assembly and the Council, right?
So we have we call it House of Assembly, but yeah, the same thing, and
Okay.
the Legislative Council.
Because I know a few of the different states have different names. I think Western Australia's got different names. I know in Queensland, where I am, we don't even have an upper house, so it's still kind of new to me how other states work for their elections.
Yeah.
So is 4 years, 8 years? Is that normal for state senates, or is that just a South Australian thing?
I'm
Because I know
not
federally
sure.
it's 6 years.
Yeah, so I know in federal terms they do. It's sort of the same as the federal one in the sense that we have a half Legislative Council or half Senate election. But I'm not sure what the terms are. I'm pretty sure in Victoria they only have 4-year terms. Correct me if I'm wrong there. So I think it is a little bit unique, but I couldn't say for sure, to be honest, because I'm not that familiar with the other states' procedures.
Do you know what Western Australia's like for that, centrist?
Not off the top of my head. I'd have to double check it. I know that we vote every 4 years. I don't think we have one that lasts every 8 years. So, not that I don't recall that. So, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, now I take it you guys are the same as everyone else with having the premier being appointed by the governor for people who have for the party with the majority in the lower house, correct? So that's still the same as every other state. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a responsible government system, which is like all of Australia, as far as I'm aware, where the executive needs to hold the confidence in the lower house and the House of Assembly to form government. But if you're from the United States, that might be quite different to what you're used to.
Yeah, there's a lot more authority put into the governor in that sense to appoint whoever they want to the ministers. Can ministers be in either house for you guys? Because I know they can in Victoria and federally.
I'm not entirely sure. I believe they can, but I'm not 100% sure on that. It's a good question. But I'm quite sure they can.
Yeah. I think that probably lays out the ground rules pretty nicely for everyone else. So has COVID been a major issue for you guys? Who wants to answer that? Has COVID been a big issue for you guys?
It's one of the big ones, same as everywhere else, but actually arguably a big one is healthcare, because first of all, it's directly linked to COVID, and secondly, the healthcare system here has been in disrepair for almost 2 decades, 1 decade at least. Like there are a ton of issues. Since we're both on the policy committee, we've been going through them quite a bit, but just to mention a few of the big ones, there's a massive shortage of hospital beds, so it's that there's a constant worry. Basically, everything regarding COVID has been just the media and politicians hyperventilating about the hospital system being overwhelmed, and no one has sort of just well, maybe that's the one thing you should spend more on if it's such a big issue. But no, of course, it's easier to enforce restrictions and such. And then there are other smaller components such as. For instance, this is something I learned about from the many acquaintances my parents have in the medical field. There are quite what would we put it? There's artificial scarcity imposed on the number of specialists available, meaning the organizations of various specialists are going to limit simply how many people are going to be certified, essentially, mostly just so they can keep their wages high. And that's once again, that's another thing that contributes to there being just simply not enough, specialists to go around. And then you have many more issues which all fall into healthcare being essentially the biggest topic in town. And if you just look around, you can see both Liberals and Labour, they both have the same idea: just dump more money into the system. And on some level, they're correct, because that's going to have to be done. Simply because it was, to be fair, it was underfunded for a while now. But at the same time, there's a lot of ways to be cut out, and the COVID measures, once those are over, it's going to free up a lot of resources.
Yeah, I think
so sorry, you go.
Yeah, I think Vitali's exactly right. COVID is an issue, and there are like a group of people that are very passionate about the COVID stuff. But I mean, we've only been locked down for, outside the national lockdowns at the start, less than 2 weeks overall. So it is an issue, but it's not as big as healthcare. Vitali's right. Healthcare is the primary issue in South Australia at the moment. And COVID has tangentially sort of showed the issues there. Also with COVID, there's sort of some tangential issues in terms of things like hospitality and sort of small businesses having a really tough time. So those kind of aspects of it are important. But I would say it of it itself is not probably as important, definitely, as say Victoria and a lot of other states.
Yeah, COVID is essentially exposed the weakness in the healthcare system for everyone to see. If before it could be ignored, it could be waved off. Now it's not possible. Even though we've had ambulances painted with that we're not being funded enough for like years now. I've been seeing them for at least 3 years, and that's just as far as I can remember. It could have been further.
We've had the same thing here in WA. McGowan was. Sorry.
No, you keep going.
Sorry, yeah, I was just about to say we had the same thing here with McGowan. Originally, he was voted in to replace the Liberals to fix the hospitals because we had issues with ramping hours and stuff, and he actually ended up making it worse without COVID. So yeah, that's a big issue that is popping up for us now, especially now that we're starting to get outbreaks of Omicron in the community. So yeah, I think it's exposing a lot of the healthcare systems across the whole country.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, yeah, it's mostly because they haven't been prepared for COVID anyway. They've been struggling even prior to that, and now it simply can't be ignored. And that's also one of the reasons why the COVID hysteria is being pushed so hard, because it's like otherwise they're going to have to address the problem, and oh no, how horrible! We're going to have to address the problem.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, I think it was 2018, I believe. Sorry. I think it was 2018, I believe.
I'll ask afterwards.
Yeah, sure. I think it was about 2018 where in South Australia, about 60% of our state budget went to healthcare. So, as much as there is a funding issue that needs to be addressed, throwing money at it is not the solution. You can only go so far with that before that becomes its own problem.
Yeah,
I mean, our state's is due to be in $25.5 billion of debt by the end of 2024 or financial year 2024. So then you run into those sort of problems in terms of interest payments, and if we see interest rates go up, which I expect they will, we're gonna have a lot of issues there as well.
So I'm taking healthcare was an issue before COVID happened, but COVID, has pushed it up the list of priorities, or was it always the most important issue for the voters?
It was definitely an issue before, and I know for a fact that the healthcare system has had issue for like 10 years at least, and it's been everything from just there not being enough staff to hospitals being closed, or like for instance, we had like one new hospital open, and yay, new hospital open, but everyone forgot to mention that they closed like 2 or 3 other ones. So the total number of spots did go down, and this has been going on for a while now. COVID simply just exposed that you can't ignore the issue anymore, and it has been mostly ignored, even though it's been an important issue for a while now.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Vitaly there. That's totally an accurate representation of what's happened here. It has been an issue, but COVID's just heightened it.
So what's the different stance between the Liberals and the Labor on that issue?
So,
because if it's that important, there's going to be obviously a lot of single issue voters. So, if people who are concerned just about that, what's the difference between the two parties' platforms on healthcare?
At this point, not much, because at this point they realize they can't do anything else but just throw money at the issue, which is why even the Liberals, who previously were essentially more or less against finding the problem to go away, now they're doing it because they have to. There's literally no other option, and I agree with them in this regard that you're going to have to do that, but at the same time you can't also support measures which go against it, such as the COVID bullshit. And with Labour, their solution is just more money once again. And I don't even know, is there a difference between them and Liberals? Maybe in the amount of money, but that's about it.
Yeah, I think it's very like slight differences. I mean, Labor's always going to sort of push the union angle and sort of go at that sort of thing. But Liberal, from what I can recall, Liberal actually plan to spend more money on fixing hospitals and healthcare related stuff than Labor do. But Labor's big thing, right, is Stephen Marshall, our Premier, who's a Liberal. He proposed this basketball stadium, which cost $652 million. And Labor have just, like, if you look at any of their policy or any of their sort of campaigning and advertising, basically that's all they're talking about, is the fact that the Liberals spent this money on the basketball stadium while our healthcare is in such a shocking state. And that's like they probably talk about this basketball stadium more than they talk about anything else.
Yeah, easy pickings. Where does the Lib Dems sit on that sort of position in South Australia?
Well, our position, I mentioned this briefly earlier, but our position is basically we're going to have to fund it, but we're going to, like, it does sort of go against our principles, because normally we don't want to just throw money at the issue, but on some level you're going to have to throw a bit of money at the issue, and then you're going to have to basically reorganize the administrative side of things, but basically try to prevent it from getting this bad in the future as well, because there are a few things I mentioned, like the specialist shortage, the hospital bed shortage, and there are a few more things which we have outlined in our policies, such as more emphasis on preventative care, so the hospital system just doesn't go under strain in the first place, and another idea which maybe James was the one who came up with, I actually don't remember, was essentially create a bypass for unions, essentially an ombudsman position where staff can essentially go to complain or report corruption or waste of resources, and which avoids unions entirely, because there have been instances in which unions have been, well, they've been more self-interested than actually willing to represent the interests of the people who participate in them. Yeah.
So I'm not 100% across it, but is all hospital spending accountable, and visible for the public?
That's actually a really good point. What I was just about to expand on, Vitaly, there is one of the things we want to address in our policy is to make the spending accountable. Because currently, I mean, if you ask the government, they'll probably say it is, but it's really not. I mean, there's no real way to get into any sort of explicit detail where that funding's going. But one thing we want to do is make pay for sort of higher level management and even the officers of the ministers, right? And the minister, him or herself, potentially, have their pay tied to the results that they're after, in terms of. So that's a bit of a trade-off for the fact that, yes, I suppose what we're looking at is not, I wouldn't say it's like a real diehard libertarian position, but we're trying to tie that sort of transparency and that accountability to these ministers to make their pay and sort of the high level bureaucrats to make their pay tied to that. So you can actually see some achievable results, because that's what's happened over the last 10 to 15 years is they've just thrown money in. We don't really see where it goes, and nothing happens, and no one really gets punished for the sort of missing their mark on their outcome.
Yeah, it's very similar in this regard to, well, any government healthcare system, but the UK one comes to mind particularly, especially when you look at how much money they're throwing at that endeavor and how bad the results are. I mean, it's just on a larger scale, but we're not that different.
Could you introduce? So, say you guys get in. Could you introduce because obviously managerial pay and stuff is one thing, and it's probably the easiest thing to target in terms of monitoring where the money's being spent. But my guess is things like the cost of medicines and stuff have an incredibly high markup as soon as it goes towards the state, because obviously in most industries, once they price things to the government, they always put on an extra bit of margin on it, because obviously the government's got to pay for it. So could you introduce an open source spending type system where everything is accountable and available to people, and then you've got the opportunity of other private companies who can then work out what's been overcharged and where they can beat it, so you can have it's sort of like a competitive market into bid for the states, bid for their for the running of the hospitals type thing. It'd be like I don't know how to explain that too well, but basically it would just open it up so that people can then point out when they're charging $10 for a Panadol or something, something ridiculous like that.
Yeah. Look, I think our position, to summarize sort of our position, and I think speaks well to what you're saying, is we're about decentralization as much as possible. Decisions should be made as close to the patient as possible, not spend time going up and down chains, and things should be transparent. And that's sort of what you're saying there. And I'm a big believer in making things as transparent as possible. So I'd definitely be very amenable to something like that, for sure.
Yeah, I don't think we have that exact point in our policy proposals, but we can always add one. So
yeah, it's just, I think it was the Elon Musk comment that actually got me thinking about that when he when they challenged him to donate however many billion it was of his thing. He said, okay, I'll do it as long as you open source the spending so we all know where the money goes. And then, yeah. So I was like, well, that's actually a pretty good concept. That if you're running it, if you take the libertarian approach, obviously the less government, the better. But if you're going to have systems in place where you have things like healthcare, which I'm for, I'm pro having a healthcare system that we can provide to people. But obviously then you've got to have your regulations in place in order to make sure that what we're seeing now isn't happening. And open source spending is probably a great way to control bloat in terms of corruption and stuff in the systems. So
I think that's exactly it. And I think that's even like sort of the more diehard libertarians here in Australia. We're pretty happy with the concept of how our healthcare system should work, at least. And I think you're exactly right. The way we should address that is by being as transparent as possible. And yes, what Vitaly said, we don't have a specific policy point on that, but our policy, I would say, does very much push for transparency, and I think that's a great way to achieve transparency.
Yeah, and honestly, with COVID tying into this, I'm not even sure, like, if we should be thankful or resentful for it, because it did sort of expose the issue to the point where you can't ignore it, but at the same time, it's also the cause of a lot of problems. Because, I mean, and this is just. Because we also did have an Omicron wave going through, well, at least my surroundings for like a few weeks ago, and it's so funny to think of for the past 2 years we were fine, didn't have any shortages or anything. Once that hits and once everyone's calling out sick, you can't order anything normal online. Every store's out online. And when you sit in quarantine, like, you just want to say screw it and just go to the store yourself, because it's just weird to me how, like,
now one thing I have noticed from watching South Australian politics a bit.
Yeah, keep going.
One thing I have seen from watching the South Australian politics over the last couple of months is I haven't really seen anything from the Labor leader. Because I know if you look at Victoria, for example, a lot of people outside of South Australia, a lot of people outside of Victoria, know about Matthew Guy, the leader of the Liberal Party, the opposition leader.
Unfortunately,
who's the leader of the Labor Party in South Australia? Because I haven't heard anything about them.
Yeah, I find that interesting that you mentioned that, because here in South Australia, I'd say it's quite popular. So his name's Peter Malinauskas. He's the leader of the Labor Party here. I think he's a bit more he's more of a moderate in terms of the Labor Party, but I don't really know how the factions work in those major parties, but that's what I think. He's very popular here. I think he's actually quite a good politician, right? He sells himself very well. He seems like a man of the people. He has that sort of image about him, and he cultivates that very well. He acts like, particularly in my age demographic, I'm 27, so in that sort of, younger age demographic, I would say he's got a huge amount of support. He's appealed very well to the hospitality industry, which I have association with from my previous jobs, and as well as the fact that through policy making and all that kind of stuff. He's very popular here, whereas Steve Marshall is kind of a bit of a nothing. He's kind of got that Scott Morrison sort of. He's like, he'll just blow whatever way the wind's going. He'll go to the latest opinion poll to sort of help him make his decision. Whereas Peter Malinauskas sort of appears to at least have some sort of convictions behind him. In terms of results, I think it's going to be a tight one. I think he'll probably do pretty well. Labor and Peter Malinauskas will probably do pretty well. In South Australia, he's got quite a profile. So it just must be a thing where it's not really translating very much into state.
Yeah.
I think it's I think all of through the last 2 years, South Australia's politicians have kept their head down quite dramatically. I think, with the exception of that lady who said "Don't catch the football," I think that was South Australia.
Nicola Spurrier. Yeah, she's crazy.
Whatever it was, that was basically all. Like, we heard, even though you guys had the face scanner app thing that was going on as well. Like, we barely heard anything coming out of South Australia. I'm actually really interested, if you don't mind.
Dropped almost instantly.
I'm not surprised. There's such a backlash to it.
Yeah.
I'm really interested, if you don't mind, I'll ask this quick question before we go on. Is you spoke about your connections with the hospitality industry, which I've known a few around in Perth and stuff as well. How are they responding to you as a Lib Dem in terms of like, do you talk about tax reform in terms of alcohol and things like that? Because obviously that's an industry where the regulations and taxing is, especially if you're into the craft beer side of things, that a lot of breweries get screwed over. So it's interesting. I'd be interested to see what sort of feedback you've got as a policy with less tax type thing.
Yeah, well, tax alcohol excise is a federal issue. But what we do address at a state level is things like liquor licensing requirements and how onerous they are, and like we have a lockout. You know, I'm not talking about COVID style lockout. I mean, back Sydney style lockouts, where it's 3 a.m. no entry or re-entry. That was brought in, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. And it's not at 3 a.m. It's not too bad. It doesn't affect too many businesses, but it is still, there's a lot of clubs that it does sort of affect. And so that's where we tackle things, and we do find that there's a lot of people really willing to sort of listen to that message. There's a lot of business owners, particularly, who are like, the sort of the hoops we have to jump through to get the licensing, and then to deal with all the requirements to meet them, and the amount of money we need to spend on it is ridiculous. But I just think at the moment they're really just focused on, we want to end restrictions, or at least reduce, allow, because currently in South Australia, most venues are operating at 50% capacity, and that just recently increased from 25% capacity. And I know from working in the hospitality industry that margins are thin, and you can't run a business at 50% capacity. It's impossible. I don't know how a lot of these businesses have survived this long. So they're really just focused on that. Like dancing and singing was banned for over 600 days in South Australia. I think singing in like karaoke venues has just been allowed to come back. But yeah, so that's really where they want to end, what they're really focused on. So in some sense, they don't really care about, I mean, they do, but they're really just focused on the COVID rules and restrictions.
In terms of Labor then, because you said Labor has quite a good thing with the hospitality, are they promising to scrap all those sort of restrictions? Is that what they're offering? So how do they get a support from the industry then? That's what I'm interested in.
They're saying, and I think it's a lot of talk, but what they're basically saying is, we'll give you more money. We'll give you more, because there are some compensation schemes in place, but they're quite heartless, as most bureaucratic things are, right? If you don't meet this very specific threshold, even if you're 0.1% away from it, well, you're done. You can, you have no access to it. Whereas Labor's sort of saying, look, we'll give you more money. And maybe that's the case, but I still think it'll be just as heartless as it is under the current government. Maybe just more money if you do make it.
So do you see positive reaction to you when you talk to these people in the industry regarding just scrapping it completely? Are the business owners prepared? Are they just done with COVID and just want to get rid of it all and get stuck into it again? Or are they still a bit cautious about COVID and what? No,
I think, like, particularly if you speak privately to them, maybe publicly they'll sort of say, like, look, we got to follow the health advice, but let's be a bit more reasonable. That's sort of the public position, sorry. But privately, they're just like, look, I'm so over this. It just needs to end. But they'll sort of take a realistic approach of, like, they basically want to do what they want to do to get their business open, or as closer to 100% open as they can. If it means they have to go to 75% capacity, then they'll sort of take that as a compromise. But really, their true intention is to just sort of end this stuff. I mean, most people here in South Australia know several people who have got Omicron and survived. So we're for a lot before we sort of opened our borders up, no one really knew anyone that had COVID, so it was a bit novel. But now it's come in, people have seen that it's not a horror story, so they're sort of, I think they're a bit over it.
Yeah, and also one thing I should perhaps mention is that in regards to hospitality and such, we do have, like, one of our policy points is to essentially give tax breaks to business affected, and it works based on a formula for how long they've been forced to shut down. Take that, times it by 2, and that's it. You're not taxed for this long.
Yeah, I think that's a better way to go about it, so you don't keep increasing the debt, because just throw more money at these sort of things. It's just dead money rather than just let the business actually do its thing and make its own money. So
well, that's what they want to do, right? I mean, obviously you need some handout money in these kind of situations, but they just want to. They don't want handouts. They want to get back to running their business.
Work.
Yeah.
We've lost Stuart. All right, cool. Well,
you're the host now.
We handled that. Any other sort of specific policies or anything that you're aiming towards in order to try and get garner support in the upcoming elections? Like, is there, obviously we talked about the health, talked about the hospitality. Is there any other sectors where you think you can gain votes against the big two? And where do you guys see yourselves going?
That's the two big ones, but we do also cover a bunch of other issues. They're essentially a bunch of small issues combined into, more structured policy proposals. So some stuff regarding taxes, essentially the attempt to scrap all state taxes, or all the unnecessary ones at least. Then some anti-corruption and political reform measures, and then there's a combination document on the subject of drugs, sex work, assisted dying or euthanasia, self-defense, and other stuff like that. James can probably go into more detail on that.
Yeah, so I think those are the main areas. In terms of industries, I think the fitness industry, we didn't write a specific policy for the fitness industry, but basically our hospitality policy is kind of a model for other industries as well. And I think the fitness industry would be a great one, because I think they've been hit really hard with the COVID stuff as well. In terms of our policies, as Vitaly said, we've had a voluntary assisted dying or a euthanasia law passed in 2020, I believe, but it's the most restrictive in the world, right? There's over 70 requirements that you need to meet to make it. And I spoke to, I spoke with one of the guys at the voluntary assisted dying group in South Australia, and he's like, look, we had to do this because they tried 17 times since 1995. Despite the fact that it has 82% public support in South Australia, and that's the only way they could pass it, is make it this restrictive. So I think we're going to address that. It's quite topical as well. Sex work. There's been so many decriminalisation attempts at sex work, and it's kind of a similar thing. So I think, and there's a bill that's still before the House that's sort of been stalled in the House that was introduced, I think, last year. So we really want to tackle that. And as Vitaly sort of touched on, is the corruption stuff. I think corruption is a big issue in this state. We had a lot of so the Liberal government's essentially a minority government because a lot of the members either got disendorsed or they defected, to independent. I think one of them even went all the way across the bench to Labor. And what Stephen Marshall did is so we have an ICAC here, but he basically neutered them. They can't really look for anything of any importance. So I think corruption here in South Australia, even though it's sort of not talked about very much, unlike, there's this big push for the federal ICAC, that's quite a topical issue. I think it's really important, and I think it's something that really needs to be desperately addressed in South Australia. And then you look at sort of the political stuff around that. Say, I know it's not in South Australia, but say you got the stuff with Andrew Bogut that happened recently in terms of like having endorsements, and then Friendly Geordies often get sort of similar things like this as well. South Australia, our sort of laws around electioneering and campaigning are very strict. Like, say, unlike a federal campaign, you have to. Someone can lodge a complaint if you have a misleading, advertisement or campaign thing. So a lot of political parties just use that. Particularly major parties against minor parties that don't have the resources will just lodge all these complaints that this thing's misleading. Just to basically tie up resources. So I think a lot of those sort of political reform and corruption issues really need to be addressed, and we have addressed them in our policies. We've got a preventing corruption policy, and we've also got protecting and empowering South Australians, which have political reform policy.
Yeah, no, that sounds all good. Obviously, I think COVID's probably not only exposed the healthcare system, but it exposed a lot of the corruption issues that we're seeing in government. I'm not sure if we're going to end up seeing federal and state-based investigations into the handling of COVID, but it's probably
We
something we
hope
should
it's
really look
unlikely.
into. And I think that'll flesh out a lot of some of the corruption in the other stuff as well. So I think you're on the money there with trying to get this. Again, it's about transparency, I guess, is we want to make sure that if you're going to spend our tax dollars, let's make sure that you aren't ripping us off and keeping you as accountable as possible, which I think is a really good policy to take. So
it's more than transparency, to be honest, because a lot of the issues here, a lot of the issues with COVID from the outset have been that there is no single accountable person. There's no fall guy for when something fails, and it could be the experts are obviously not going to get the boot because they're not elected. They're not going to be the only thing you can really do to the experts is either investigate them or essentially force the government in one way or another to basically stop listening to their advice and kick them from in the future being able to give that advice. But even with the elected people, I mean, to be frank, even just due to the COVID measures alone, due to the fact that we even had restrictions, that's reason enough for Marshall and the Liberals to get kicked out. But who's going to replace them? Well, Labour, who's basically the same on most regards. That's the issue, more or less.
So then, are you feeling on the ground there's a groundswell towards minor parties? Like we see it online a bit, and we see a lot of you notice a lot of, especially on the right, in terms of conservatives who normally would vote Liberals, defecting away from the Liberal Party. Do you get that feel on the ground that people are disenfranchised with the two majors and they're going to look to vote minor?
You definitely get the feel that they're disenfranchised. I mean, Kanel Tonkin, our candidate in the federal level, the Senate candidate, is an ex-Liberal. He's a young former young Liberal of the Year, a former young Liberal of the Year. So there's definitely that, particularly from Liberals, from the Liberal Party. I mean, but there's it's a bit of a roadblock in some sense. One, the United Australia Party, as far I can't speak for them, but as far as I'm aware, they're not registered in South Australia, and as far as I'm aware, they're not going to run in South Australia. So you sort of have that lack of resources that Clive Palmer pumping a lot of money into here. But there's a lot of also sort of people who are just like, I'm so over this whole thing that I'm just going to cast an informal vote, or I'm just going to cop the fine and not vote. So you kind of got to battle. In some ways, you almost got to battle both sides. You've got to battle the major party, and also the people who are so disengaged that they just can't be bothered. Or can't bring them. They think the whole thing's corrupt.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Because I know also from Kenan that he's been saying that there have been mass conversions from Liberals to Lib Dems, but the extent of that isn't. Well, it's not that big. We're still a minor party in terms of membership as well. But at the same time, as James said, a lot of people are more likely to just go into apathy instead of voting for minor parties. But at the same time, just the fact that there are quite a number of minor parties here, the president protests, they're actively promoting themselves. My prediction is we'll see an outflow from major parties to minor parties. It's probably not going to be enough, to form a government which isn't going to be dominated by one of the majors, but it's going to at least signal to them that they have to change course, or they're going to get BTFO'd harder and harder each time.
Yeah, I think to add to that, and maybe this could fill in a bit of what people don't know about the South Australian politics. So as I said right back at the start of this, there's 11 seats up for grabs in the Legislative Council. The quota in South Australia is only 8.33%. So that's quite low when you think about, say, national, where it's like 14% to get in the Senate. So it's very, I anticipate that Liberal Democrats will win at least one Legislative Council seat, and perhaps someone like One Nation might as well. So the way it works is with the 11 seats, in a typical time, usually 8 of them get grabbed by the major parties, 4-4 or maybe a 5-3 split. And then those other 3 are up for grabs. And I definitely think those 3 are very well up for grabs for active minor parties such as ourselves, the Liberal Democrats. I also think maybe this year, given all the sort of sentiment away from major parties, we may even see a 4th one up for grabs, and potentially even a House of Assembly seat that's up for grabs, 1 or 2 of them that are up for grabs as well.
Yeah, I sort of see that across a few different states. There seems to be a push to the minor parties. The one thing I sort of like, I'm pretty much decided I'll be voting Lib Dems this year. But my concern with the Lib Dems at the moment is that is a theme trending that they are becoming a conservative party, which obviously you guys mentioned your assisted dying laws, your drugs and sex laws. You know, those sort of things appeal to the left libertarian side of the spectrum, which I think is a big section of the population who are now politically homeless. They don't want to vote Labor because they know that it's the same shit, different day. But I think that the messaging around the Lib Dems could be targeted a bit better towards some of those left libertarian sort of leaning people, because like I've spoken to a few of the guys on the federal level state, like the side, and they do keep pushing, let's go get the Liberal vote, let's go get the Liberal vote. But the Liberals are losing their voters. Like, they're already voting for someone else. So you don't really have to chase that hard. I think it's that section that's missing, which is why I was really interested in your stance on the hospitality side of things, because obviously the hospitality industry tends to lean left in terms of how they vote. So ideally, using the Lib Dems platform to be able to reach across the aisle, I think is going to be really important in terms of having a big impact in incoming elections. Do you feel that as well?
I 100% agree with you. I'm actually in Canberra at the moment, checking out the convoy, right, down at the camp, you know, the epic caravan bank. I would say most of the people there are probably like left libertarian. You know, I know that's very contrary to what you hear on mainstream media, but that would be, you know, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of like, you know, sort of free love, you know, like, you know, Woodstock sort of vibes, you know, that you get here. And I think that's absolutely the case with a lot of these things. I think a lot of people are, you know, they're probably maybe a bit more hesitant to free market sort of ideas, and they're sort of a bit worried about, you know, particularly when you see things like Twitter and Facebook and this sort of censorship with social media. They're maybe a bit more worried about that side of things, but they're actually more open to embracing sort of social libertarianism, you know, on things like drugs or sex work or those kind of areas, particularly now that you sort of have that bodily autonomy argument being come through with you know, mandates and vaccines and all that kind of stuff. So I definitely, I agree with you a lot, and that's not to take away. I think there's some great people in our party, you know, Campbell Newman and Canel and John Ruddick that are a bit more, you know, ex liberals. But, you know, you've got people like David Limbrick, which he's a true, I mean, I've never met him, but from my speaking with him and from my interactions that I have had with him, he is a true libertarian, you know, like in the sense, and I think I am a true libertarian as well. So there's definitely that in the party. And, you know, I think that the messaging at the moment is a little bit focused on that end, but it's still very much the heart of the party. We are a libertarian party at our heart, and I think.
Also, if I may, conservatives good. Like, just on the policy committee, I'm basically the only sort of conservative guy there, so I can attest. Basically, the majority of the party is libertarians.
Good.
Like,
it's just
we have arguments on that stuff.
And I'm not saying that. Obviously, the reason I asked that is because I come from the center left type thing, and I've been drawn to the party. So it's not like I disagree with having a more right wing members of the party. I think that's a good thing. I think you should be having balance between both left and right. But I did find that it's a trend that they are targeting certain demographics when there's a whole swath of people that could be lured to a third party option versus the duopoly that we have in Australia. So it wasn't necessarily a knock. It was just a question regarding messaging and stuff. Because obviously I like the idea of free market, but I'm pretty pro social healthcare. So it's a mix between the two. So
yeah, well, you're going to have to find a compromise somewhere, and the Liberal Democrats to me seem to be the best possible one, especially since they are still largely libertarian. Like, if you take a look at the drug and sex policy, you can see that I've made no impact at all.
Yeah. It was actually funny. I read an article the other day because obviously one of the concerns when people think is Campbell Newman is has a history of being quite a not quite libertarian. But I did see an article the other day where he'd basically said that he's changed his mind on the drug rules and that the drugs, like the way we're going about it was wrong. And I was like, oh, well, if you can change, you can change. I'm happy with that. Like if he's going to keep moving towards that sort of policy, then yeah, like I don't mind. Yeah, it's a good thing to have people moving back towards it, which I think is good. So.
Yeah, that's
Centrist has a long-standing debate over whether or not Campbell Newman is truly libertarian. It's a long-standing issue between us.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, as you said earlier, people change, you know, and I think that's part of it. And I think so, you know, you get caught up in major parties, in all the internal politics and managing all that. So I do think, you know, I think he is libertarian. He's probably on the sort of softer end of libertarianism than someone like myself or yourselves. Maybe he's a bit closer to Vitali. But I think he's come a long way. He actually very recently in one of the Liberty Chat podcasts sort of discussed the Vlad stuff, which obviously was a big point, you know, about when he first joined the party. So I do think he's come a long way, and I do think he's definitely, at heart at least, he's definitely a libertarian.
Well, I will concede that people can change their beliefs a lot. The best example of that is with Michael Latham, the former federal leader of the Labor Party, and now he's One Nation.
Yes.
So
Princeton,
yes.
I think messaging is key, though, which is I think what how the system's rigged against some of the smaller parties is because obviously you don't have the resources to message as well as the two majors. So, like, even then finding out that he was pro, like, decriminalization of drugs or whatever it was, I think in the article, like, I had to literally fluke find that article of him saying it. Like, I assumed he was all like lock him up, throw away the key type thing. But yeah, I think with the advent of social media is going to make things a bit easier for you. But yeah, that messaging is key. Got to get it out.
The state conference also would have been helpful. Do we want to touch on that a bit, just on the surface level?
Sorry, say that again.
The state conference, James. Should we cover that at least on the surface?
The state what? Sorry,
the state conference.
State conference.
Oh, the state conference. Oh, no.
Okay, we'll leave it.
So, aside from healthcare, I guess, which is a major issue, are there any other non-COVID issues that are important to set the Australian voters heading to the election?
Yeah, we did mention a few while you were away. I think.
Yes, I lost connection.
Yeah, we've touched on the drug, sex, poker system dying, stuff like that. What else was there? Oh yeah, the anti-corruption and political reform section. There's also the taxes section, which I mentioned briefly, which is actually... James, go on.
To tie in also what you said earlier about what you just mentioned about sort of rigging for the major parties, what Peter Malinauskas, the leader of the Labor Party here in South Australia, has very, very recently proposed, and it seemed like he initially proposed it offhand in sort of a radio interview as not a real proposal, but just a bit of a comment. But since then, he's really doubled down on it, is removing private funding from elections. So he wants to make elections 100% publicly funded, which I very much oppose. But the good thing about him talking about that is it has opened up this discussion. And of course, making public funding would basically kill almost all the minor parties. So I think it's
I fund the big parties anyway. I'm not voting for them.
Exactly.
How would that even work? Because the party that's in would have access to all the funds, then, wouldn't they? So
pretty much.
Really have a proper election.
Okay,
that's it. Unless you've got someone like Clive Palmer who can, just bankroll the whole campaign. You're not really.
But if he wants to block that, then you eliminate Clive Palmer.
No, sorry, by private I mean private donations, right? So if you've got your own. If you've got your own, a lot of money yourself, you could run a campaign, I suppose. But in terms of disallowing donations. I think that's a terrible idea. There's so many issues I have with it, from the fact that taxpayers shouldn't be forced to pay for political parties they don't like, as well as the fact that you're totally killing almost all minor parties. But I think that, as I said earlier, the great thing is open that discussion, and we can say, look, the key here, as has been a bit of a thread of this interview and our policy document, has been transparency, right? As long as you make the donations transparent, and so in simple English, people can look at this and see what's going on. I think that's the real answer, and that's the real key, and that's what our policy is, among many other points, but that's a key focus of our policy.
Yeah.
So I think your point there about minor parties is probably a very important one for South Australia, because from what I understand, the Liberal Party does not have a majority in either house, correct?
They were voted in with a majority government, but since they've had a few scandals and issues, they are now a minority government, yeah.
So how does that play out for them for COVID measures? Because I don't think you guys have any of the major right-wing parties. So from memory, I think the only kind of right-wing is that you have is Xenophon, who's centrist.
Yeah, Xenophon likes to say he's centrist, but he's probably quite left-wing, I would say.
Yes.
At least, Labor left-wing, centre lefty. But in terms of COVID stuff, well, the thing is, our COVID laws, and that's another thing we're addressing in our COVID policy, is reforming the emergency laws. They're really bad. Like a lot of people talked about the Victorian stuff that happened, which is awful. Don't get me wrong, I think it's terrible. And the new Victorian laws are worse than our laws. But in South Australia, yes, they need parliamentary input to pass the law. And while I need to recheck the Emergency Management Act before so don't quote me definitively those, there's no real need to ever extend it. Or if there is, it's certainly a long time before you need to get parliamentary approval to extend it. So they've basically just been going to the governor every month and getting extension from the governor. And we haven't had any parliamentary input since we imposed it back in March 2020, I think it was. So, that's definitely something that really needs to be addressed. And that's really worrying, the power that, you have in that sort of space.
Yeah.
Could it be argued that the reason why Labor wants to put in that policy of stopping private donations would be to ensure that that there's not that minor party problem, because the minor parties have the balance of power in both houses. So it would be reasonable to assume that if that proposal went through, we wouldn't see that hung parliament anymore.
I think that might be part of it. But honestly, I think he just kind of said it offhand, as maybe one of his personal opinions, sort of in a radio interview. And then he got some feedback to hear that it was popular. And that's what I think is really the motivation behind it.
Yeah.
Popular by who? It's like, who wants that?
People like that. People like that rhetoric,
Oh,
People like the rhetoric of like,
because when he says that, people think, that's going to stop people like Clark Palmer.
Exactly.
Texting me all the time when it's not
really
going on.
Oh well.
Or they think of like a lot of the things like, say, Fred and Geordie's talked about, like stopping that kind of, which is, I agree, I agree with a lot of that stuff. It should be stopped, but I don't think that's the method to stop it.
Yeah. Also, I should probably mention this. This has been a topic of question for a while, but the Lib Dems do have a position of just removing all the COVID restrictions. They are not going to, unfortunately, in my view, they're not going to attempt to basically prohibit mandates by businesses, because to me that's like, it's not enough to simply just remove all the government measures. That's a good start, but it's not going to address the issue if there is a bypass. And the businesses enforcing those rules themselves is that sort of bypass where the government can simply pressure them without doing it themselves.
Yeah, that's what we're saying now, aren't we? Because obviously a lot of restrictions, mandates. They're mandates. They're not actual laws and stuff that have been put in place. And the hard part now is it's been a system that's been pushed and pushed and pushed. And even if you were to say now scrap all restrictions, some businesses will still do it because they
and it's not even that. You can see in the United States, like in Florida, they've outlawed all the sort of mandates, and it's still happening. People are still doing it by themselves in schools. Like teachers who are nuts are still pushing mask mandates and such. Like people are willing to break the law in order to keep doing it. So like if there's no law in the first place, like what chance do you have?
I mean, here in South Australia, right? We just not here. I'm in Canberra, but in South Australia, we just very recently, I think last weekend, we scrapped QR codes for retail businesses, and so many of them still have them up. And I asked them, I'm like, "What's like?" I thought I didn't need to do this anymore. They're like, "No, but customers have been asking us to keep them because they want them safe without them."
Shame.
They've done a number on people's mental stability. Like there's been a big, massive number done on. I think it's the same in New South Wales. Speaking to someone, they were saying like none of the restrictions are in place, but still some people are signing in, even though no data is being collected and no, like you're doing nothing with it. Like it's just
I mean, since Omicron, it's absolutely I mean, I thought it was already very problematic from the very start, but like even if you want to accept the incursion into our liberties, since Omicron, I mean, it's been absolutely 100% redundant. You know, it's just
that's been no logic for a while, and I guess we can just safely say that Malone was correct. Mass formation psychosis is happening on a massive scale.
I think with the, like you said, with the QR at the start, like I think it was sold and you could understand it being put in place in order to contact tracing at the very start, because obviously we didn't know what was happening. But we saw it really early on here in WA where the police misused the data.
Yes. Of course they did.
The problem is, right, they did it and they caught a bad guy, which, you know, like, you're like, because they got a murder or whatever it was off the streets. But at the same time, like, the cops were like, well, we knew we weren't supposed to use it, but we would do it again. And I was like, well, then if you can't trust your police force to do the thing that they're not supposed to do, then why are we following all the rules?
100%. And I think one of the less insidious examples of that, I mean, in terms of sort of it being like a secretive use, is the application of, we haven't seen this in South Australia, thankfully, but in other states, the application of of vaccine passports to that, right? It was originally sold as just a QR code, just for contact tracing, and now you're applying the vaccine passport to that same system. It's like, well, no, that's not what you told us.
Well, that's why you shouldn't send this stuff in the first place, because it's obvious that's where it's going to go. like once again, just look at Canada. Look at what they've had happen, and it started probably in the very same way. Just it's just a QR code, bro.
I think the best example to follow is probably Israel. I think from the start, but if you want to know what's coming,
restrictions.
if you want to know what's coming to Australia, basically just check what Israel did 2 months ago. That's how you've been able to predict it. Everyone sort of, if you knew the passports were coming, if you paid any attention to Israel, because they put in the green pass almost instantly. They've done it here too, but the trick with what they've done is that the QR, the passport system's actually a different app to the QR thing. So technically it wasn't the same thing, but they put it in place, and the rules are arbitrary. We already know that the passport doesn't do anything because the vaccinators still spread COVID. So it like that purely should be the reason to get rid of it, but the rules that, like, obviously WA and Victoria probably had two of the more authoritarian type governments moving towards this.
And,
for example,
Michael Gunner in that Northern Territory.
Oh yeah, the Northern Territory. Yeah, I forgot about that. He's been quiet for a little bit. That's why.
Yeah.
So in WA, for example, now like you can go into Aldi and buy all the food you want to buy, but as soon as you put a 6-pack of beer from there onto the conveyor belt, you have to prove a vaccine passport.
That's
so
insane.
We already know that it's a punishment thing. Like it was never, the system's not designed there to care about your health with COVID. It's definitely a system that's being used by the government in order to have control over people. So,
well, for me, I just find that so disgusting. You know, it's like, it's one thing to say that we're defiling your bodily autonomy for, you know, some measurable health outcome. You know, I think that's problematic enough, but to just use it as a punitive measure, I think that's absolutely. I mean, bodily autonomy is probably the most fundamental tenet of a free society. You know, maybe free thought, but then the very next one is bodily autonomy. And once you get rid of that, I mean, how much longer until you don't have free thought anymore? You know, so I think just for punitive measures, that's terrible. That's one of the really most egregious things. And the fact that it's just being so callously done with such little pushback is also really disgusting.
It's actually the scariest part is it's being cheered on by a lot of the public, which is probably the scariest bit of all.
Well, unfortunately, it's also very predictable because once again, sheep everywhere. Like, what can I say, man?
I try not to use that term because it's just it gets end up being like, you know what I mean, just that being
it's divisive language.
Well, how else do you describe it? People who just don't want to be informed. I mean,
also people are too busy to be informed.
Yeah,
that's the other thing. If you've got kids and stuff, and you're working 10 hours a day, you don't have time for this shit.
Well,
you just do whatever you can to get the pills.
That's very understandable under normal conditions. Not when your life is being affected to this degree, and your kids are going to be affected because they're going to get vaccine.
I'm just saying that's why I paid attention.
Yeah, but at that point, I don't think there's an excuse for ignorance. I mean, you can only push so far before you'll have to get involved.
Mm. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah,
but I think, sorry, there was an interesting, just to go back to the vaccine passport point, there was an interesting thing in what happened here in South Australia. It never got implemented because Omicron came, and then Marshall decided to just like put massive restrictions in instead. But what they were going to do here is actually allow, it was just in hospitality, allow businesses to do it if they wanted to, and then they would have 100% capacity, or they could choose to not discriminate and only get 75% capacity, which the businesses really hated because it kind of made them the bad guy now. You know, they had to be the ones, and like when I was, you know, sort of consulting my policy around different hospitality, you know, groups and owners, that was one of the, you know, I put that as a point, like no incentivized discrimination. That was one of the things they all really, really agreed with me on, like, because I really hated that position they were sort of forced into.
Yeah, it's very, very fascist techniques in order to get compliance from corporations, which is a dangerous path to walk down, which is what they're doing here as well in WA. Similar sort of things. The thing is, so it's interesting because obviously we're seeing across the world passports get dropped. So obviously the Lib Dems are anti-passport, anti-mandate, which is great. And we're seeing a lot in other countries, and I'll say drop in terms, like at the moment they've dropped them. We've seen a lot of countries backflip and put more restrictions back in when things get a bit scary for them. Do you see that happening here, or do you see us proceeding further with the passports and systems?
I definitely think in the short term, we'll see a bit of easing at least, whether it's fully dropped or not. It's hard to tell. I think here in South Australia, with the election coming up, Marshall's already started easing certain things, like I said, the QR codes and the density restrictions and the singing now in karaoke bars. And I think with the federal election, there might be a bit of a push from the federal government to sort of get some states to ease things, at least the Liberal states. But I think long term, I do think it's peaked. I think it peaked maybe back in November, December in terms of COVID. But I think a lot of the sort of underlying powers, you know, abusing emergency powers and sort of ruling by decree and sort of this real totalitarian one figure sort of rules the state or the country. I think that has a long way to go. I mean, look, it took us 2 years to get here. It's going to take us at least 2 years to get out of it.
Well,
yeah,
it didn't even take us 2 years. It's been going on for 2 years, but it's been there since the beginning.
Yeah,
it was literally the snap authoritarianism.
Yeah, great. I think a lot of people have woken up to that, to use that catchphrase, which is why you're seeing this slight push towards liberty-minded people in Australia specifically. And talk personally, like you talk about the more controversial topics like gun control and stuff like that, and you'll see that a lot of people have sort of started to realize just what overreach the government has in terms of what you should be allowed to do. So I think it's going to be an interesting time for Australia, especially with the upcoming elections. I think we're going to see. I I think it's going to be. It's a completely different landscape. It's hard to tell what's going to happen, but like it's definitely a lot of change happening in the way Australians view government. I think. Which is good.
It is. And also one more thing I probably want to mention about the COVID stuff is there's also going to have to be at some point a discussion about what's the permanent solution to this, because you only really have two options if you want to address this fully. You either have to add the medical status to the anti-discrimination legislation, or you have to blow open all of anti-discrimination legislation and just go for full freedom of association. Because that's the only two ways you can really go if you go to be consistent. And honestly, the first option is the more likely one, but to be fair, neither of them are really likely. It's much more likely that there's going to be just, even if we get away that there's going to be a band-aid solution on the problem, as in, it's going to be, you can't discriminate based on vaccine status. That's the best possible case scenario, but it's not going to go further.
Yeah, I think sort of back to the sort of a sort of maybe a libertarian rising in Australia, if you want to call it that. I think the fact that you've seen, I'm here in Canberra, I would say, it's not an exaggeration to say there's around 100,000 people here that have come from all over the country, from Queensland. I mean, obviously not Western Australia, but from Queensland.
Back in.
From South Australia. It's a 14-hour drive. I did the drive, right? It's 14 hours. It's not an easy trip. To see that from individualists, which we're not really particularly big on collectivizing and joining together. The fact that there's individuals that motivated to do this kind of thing, I mean, that shows that there's something here to this.
Well, and hey, just the whole, like, the Canada station, that has been the most positive story of the past months. I mean, where else have you seen action on such scale?
Yeah.
So touching on that, that's obviously we're talking about the trucker convoy that started where they basically set up in Ottawa. So you reckon there's like 100,000 people? Is there a lot of trucks, or is there?
I would say there is a few, but it's probably people. Yeah, there's a lot of people. Look, there is a few trucks. There's a fair few trucks, but it's probably not as much as like Canada, where it seems to be, at least, mostly trucks. Here, it's just a lot more people in their station wagons or in their cars that have just popped up. But I mean, it's really interesting because it's very diverse. I mean, you see combi vans, like 70s combi vans. You see, people in BMWs. You see people in old beat up Fords or Holdens. You see people with their corporate, and I'm not talking about like sort of an emblazing that's related to this event. I mean, just like their corporate emblazoned vehicle. You see all kinds. It's quite good. It is really the Woodstock of our generation. I don't say that lightly. I 100% think that's what this is like right now.
The true diversity of cars.
Well, talking about diversity, what is the makeup like? So obviously, if we talk about how media portray things, it's obviously a certain demographic. They try and label everyone who goes to these, like the rallies, which I've shown on our live streams before, which are completely wrong on how they label people. But what's the diversity breakup like there? Is there a lot of different people?
I think it's one of the most diverse things in Australia I've ever seen. As I said earlier, I think there's a lot of sort of left libertarian people, but I mean, you've got like true hippies. You know what I mean? At least a modern iteration of them. That have the dreaded hair and play hacky sack and wear the beanies. You've got that kind. You've got a lot of Indigenous people here. You've got flags from all countries, and all kinds of foreign people. I saw people in like hijabs and Islamic sort of dress. It's everything. It really is. You see sort of Aussie sort of bogan style. You do see them, but you see everything. Country people, city people. It's one of the most diverse events I've ever been to, at least in my life.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, like I said, the media doesn't portray it well. I think they did, though, mention, like, for the first time, which is interesting, they did talk about the I believe you had a welcome to country or a smoking ceremony, and they talked about the representation for the Aboriginal people, because we've seen it at some of the rallies. The ones we've been to in Perth had smoking ceremonies and stuff as well. So the label of the white nationalist type type movement stuff is really it's starting to become unstuck, and I think the more people see that, hopefully then we'll start seeing a bit more of a rise against sort of the government narrative, so to speak.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think there's been a massive connection at the rallies in Adelaide as well, but particularly this convoy here. There's been a massive connection with sort of Indigenous practices and Indigenous culture, and I think the white nationalist stuff is, I mean, even the sheer numbers alone just show that's just not possible. It's not practical in any way.
Yeah,
like
well,
I'm
nobody
sure.
buys it.
Yeah, I'm sure there's someone hijacking something somewhere trying to get involved or whatever, but like you're never going to stop that no matter what.
I mean, look,
happens.
if I went through every person, I might find one. I'm not going to lie. There might be one or two in there if I went through and looked for them. But they're massive. They're enough. There's so few of them. It's not even worth talking about, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, and at the same point, the media has overused the term so many times that nobody cares. And I mean, like, that's the you can't take those people seriously after, like, it's just white nationalism they're going after. Well, why not all kinds of racial nationalism? Oh, because we support, other kinds of it. So screw them. Like,
I think the labeling of Aboriginal people who were at these protests and rallies and stuff as Nazis was quite telling. I know personally in my life, that's when some people that I know had sort of woken up to what was going on and went, hang on, you can't call. Like, it makes no sense. None of it does make any sense. Once you start
wear it as a badge of honor. Being hated by those people is good.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing I've gone to risk, like anti-vaxxer, right? That's the term they love to use. It's like, you know what? If you want to define anti-vaxxer in such a broad way that it's basically you're against authoritarianism, I'm a proud anti-vaxxer, then I'll wear it.
I've said the same. Yeah. They've literally changed the definition in the dictionary in order to include people who are anti-mandate as an anti-vaxxer. Yeah. So technically, yes.
Yeah, I had a friend who was talking about she just got her booster, and she was talking about how that's it. She doesn't want to get another booster. And people called her a person who's had 3 COVID vaccines, who's talking about a hypothetical one that doesn't even exist yet, an anti-vaxxer. I mean, it's just meaningless. It's a meaningless phrase.
It's coming because the Omicron one's not due out until March. So there's definitely going to be at least one more. And if you look at, like I said, Israel's the model we tend to follow. They haven't quite pushed the 5th. They've slowed back a bit on it. But if you look then to Holland actually said that they're probably going to put 6. They're going to go for 6. Yeah. So, like, if you just follow any of the news around, I don't think that they're stopping anytime soon. So the longer it goes on, the more people will start going, this isn't right. Obviously,
that's it. Yeah.
And it's not even about, I think what you'll find is, again, it's not even about, like, science aside, like, forget all about that stuff. It's the demanding that you take something constantly for the rest of your life. The threat of that, I think, will be what wakes a lot of people up into terms of what's going on. So,
and I think a lot of people will just be thrown onto the other side, even from pure laziness, right? From just forgetting to get your, and then all of a sudden, particularly if you're in a state where there's very strict, discrimination stuff with people who haven't been vaccinated, then all of a sudden you're on that side and you see what it is like, and that's going to wake you up as well.
And also, this is why the Canada convoy is so important, because the civil disobedience on that scale is a rare occurrence, but it's exactly what needs to happen. It's basically what I've been advocating for as a good solution for, like, the past few months. Like, that's the best possible alternative to political violence. Just do that. Like, force them to listen to you. Like, even if you look back at history, like back in the times of the Roman Republic, you just look at, like, the succession of the plebs, which was basically the convoy of its time, where the people who hadn't been listened to, they just left, camped out on the middle of a hill, and the elites had to listen to them eventually.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things I've really been pushing is make compliance for business as expensive as possible, and then the market will do the rest.
Yeah, it's hard. I try not to, like, it's a tight one to walk, because obviously if you're involved in the small business area, they're the ones who are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Obviously, the big businesses can afford to cop all that sort of shit. The small businesses are like you said, just trying to get open again, and will do whatever they can to try and keep the business afloat. So I try not to I don't like when people go in, because obviously I'm unvaxxed, so I'm one of the priors over here in Western Australia. But I don't like that people go in there and start arguing with the 14-year-old girl who's serving.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I condone that stuff. But I mean, in terms of just don't support those businesses. Like, say here, right in Canberra, there's a McDonald's right near the convoy camp. And you go in there, it's like 2019. No one's wearing a mask. It's it's great. But because they know if they started enforcing that policy, they would lose thousands of dollars a day. So it's just about that kind of attitude. Don't be a dick. Don't be aggressive. They're just doing their job. But be assertive or maybe not even assertive, but just spend your money in places that deserve your money, that support the cause and are worthy of it.
Yeah, we had that with the last protest here as well. One of the well-known bars banging the passport thing early. And so no one from the protest, which is really I was quite surprised considering the last time the protest that I went to was there. That place was packed, from people who were at the protest. We had to walk ages to try and find someone to go grab a beer. So this time around, they wouldn't have had anyone in there from the protest. And with the CBD struggling the way it is in Perth, it would have been telling. So
yeah, definitely. Well, one thing I'm doing is I'm keeping a list of businesses that are, not ones that are just being forced by law, but they're going over and above the law or bringing things in early. And I'm going to never support them again, even once all this is gone. So that's the way I'm acting on that.
Well, before we finish up, sorry, you go.
I want to
do that one last question.
Pivot back a bit to the state election stuff, because obviously that's the main reason we have you here. I know that federally, people like John Ruddock and that have been pushing the recall election stuff. Is that something the South Australian Party is going to try and bring in at the state level as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're committed to the Freedom Manifesto, and we will implement the Freedom Manifesto wherever it's possible at a state level. Obviously, it's a federal document, so it's more aimed at the Commonwealth level.
Yeah.
But whatever's applicable at a state level, we're definitely going to push that. And I really love the recall election. That's one of my favorite parts. And I think it really ties in well with our own state-based political reform stuff. We haven't specifically put it in a state policy because it's in the Freedom Manifesto. So the state policies are kind of an addition to the Freedom Manifesto, and you can continue.
Most of the policies that we've been working on as the policy committee, they're aimed at state-level issues, which is why healthcare and hospitality are and COVID are so high on the priority list, while a lot of other stuff has been overlooked. Because we're essentially complementing our national policy and applying it more precisely to our situation. That's the purpose.
Because I think the recall thing would actually be a big vote grabber for you. I don't think people know what recall elections are. So that's the hardest part. Obviously, again, it's all down to messaging. But I think that you could tell someone on the ground before they vote and go, hey, look, we're the only party that actually wants to introduce a policy where if you don't like the job we're doing, you can get us kicked out and put someone else in. Which I think most people, like I said, most apathetic people that don't pay a lot of attention to the politics side of things will be like, well, that's a fucking good idea, because then I can, you know what I mean? I think you'll end up winning a lot of votes off it. So it's a nice thing to try and introduce. It's a good policy.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of it.
I think the problem there with the idea of recalls is that the premiers aren't elected by the people; they're elected by one electorate. So, whereas if you look at the US recall votes, the entire state votes to recall the governor or the person in question. Whereas that's a lot harder here. You can't justify having the entire state vote to recall them, but only the electorate can vote to elect them. That to me doesn't seem fair to the people who elected them in the first place. Because if the electorate votes them in and the electorate votes against recalling them, but the entire state supports recalling them, then it's not really fair on that electorate.
Yeah. Wow. So as the Freedom Manifesto policy, which we would be more than happy to implement at the state level, is that you can do it for a single electorate. So if you get a certain amount of signatures in a single electorate, you'd have a recall of that single electorate. Or if you get a certain amount of signatures nationwide or statewide in this case, you could recall. You could basically have a double dissolution election and recall the whole lot.
Yeah, there are limitations. There are limitations on how many people it has to reach before it's considered. So that's going to weed out some of the more disingenuous attempts, because you're going to have enough people to really force the issue. It's essentially, basically it's I suppose, yeah, it's a way to protest that specific elected politician you don't like inscribed in law, which you can use in a kind of quick measure. It's actually possibly the best alternative to protest which I've seen, because if you're able to get to that point, well, it most likely means the person has done something which is warranted to get him out force.
Well, I think the response has been a perfect example. Like if you look at Dan Andrews in Victoria, I'm pretty sure a lot of people would have voted to recall. Despite voting him in with a pretty big majority over here in WA, I think you find a lot of it now is probably split 50-50. There's a lot of support for him still, but there's also a lot of people who have now just had enough of it. So those sort of systems to be put in place would be quite beneficial, because we're looking down at another 3 years of Mark McGowan. So,
and especially because there's 4 years between elections, meaning that if you stuck with someone who is not either not good at a job or is actually working against you, it'll take time for them to get out, and by that point, the society is going to be ruined, as we can see now.
Well, I think John Ruddock in the video recently that the Liberal Democrats put out made a good point, right? If you're in a relationship with someone, you shouldn't have to wait 3 years to break up with them, right? You should be able to break up with them immediately.
Yeah.
And I think
and
good
this
analogy.
is arguably more important than a relationship.
Yeah.
Cool. Oh, well, I
So
think
before we
is there
finish
anything
up-
you guys want to? Oh, sorry.
I wanted to get your predictions for the election. What you hope will happen and what you think will happen if they're different.
I would love to have 2 legislative council seats. We win. The Liberal Democrats win 2 legislative council seats and a House of Assembly seat. In terms of the sort of wider, the major parties in the overall contest, I mean, it's so hard for me to tell what I want. I suppose. Look, actually, I think, and this applies at all levels, I think what the Liberals really need is to be out of office for a few election cycles. I really think that's what they need, because I think there's a lot of hangers-on in the Liberal Party that are just there because they, for some reason, seem to win a lot of elections. So that attracts people who just want to advance their career. So I actually think, even though I probably slightly align with the Liberal Party a little bit more, even though as marginal as that may be, I actually think it'd be better for Labor to come in, both at a federal level and at a state level, and let the Liberals be out of office for a few election cycles. In terms of what I think will happen, look, I think we're really in with a strong chance of getting definitely 1 legislative council seat, maybe even 2. I think a House of Assembly seat is very difficult. Always lower house seats are very difficult for a minor party, but you never know. You get the right candidate in the right marginal seat with the right preference flows, and you never know what can happen. In terms of the broader contest, I think it'll be quite close. I think we might have a quite similar result to 2018. And I think it's hard because Labor's got a lot more vocal support, but I think the Liberals often have that sort of silent voter portion. I think the Liberals will just edge it out. It might even be a minority government that they have to form, but they'll just edge it out.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, the problem with Labour getting in is short term they're going to fuck us, probably harder than the Liberals. Yeah, but in terms of my predictions, I probably did outline them a bit before. But what I would like to happen is, I mean, mostly similar to James, but I do hope that there's going to be a massive outflow of votes to, the UAP if they're present, if not, the Liberal Democrats, One Nation, basically any other minor party. Essentially, all I really want to happen is for both Liberals and Labour to get massive outflows of voters, because that's going to be a huge signal to them. And and what I think will happen is that, well, I think that will happen to some extent, maybe not as much as I'd like to, and it's likely that whatever seats the minor parties get is going to be, well, obviously not enough to prevent any of the big two from getting in and having enough power to do whatever they want. I don't really have a prediction on whether it's going to be Liberals or Labour, although if I had to guess, it's probably going to be Labour. But yeah.
All right. Do you guys want to plug where people can find before we finish up? Do Twitter or anything else like that you guys have?
Yeah, sure. So you can find me on Twitter my handle is @James_Hol, as it should be spelled in the little box with my name on it, HOL. So just my name. Feel free to find me there. Facebook, I'm not very active on, so I mean, you can find me under my name, but it's not. You probably find most of my content on Twitter.
Yeah, and you can find me on Twitter @Vitklim Vitaly. It should be linked in the podcast description and on the Oslo Liberty Network Twitter. And, well, I do have one more thing to add. Join the Liberal Democrats and volunteer if you can.
Absolutely.
Results.
Absolutely. That is the good thing about a minor party. I'll just be quick with this. That is a good thing about a minor party, is it's really easy. If you're active, you can get on policy committees, you can get in campaign committees, you can really be involved with the party and really shape the direction of the party. And also, just a quick plug, also the Liberal Democrats South Australian Twitter page, which is @LibDemSA. You can also find them on all the other major social media platforms too.
All right, thank you.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me.